Kyle Busch was a 22-year-old pumped full of testosterone prior to his 2008 season, a toxic substance that James Cameron, potentially even Denny Hamllin, wanted out of his system based on how aggressively the two raced for the lead on lap 65. But for this colorful youngster, and I'm not just talking about his new M&M's paint scheme catching the eyeballs of children across the nation, he was ridiculously good in his debut race for Joe Gibbs Racing. He dominated the race, but as most races at non-real racetracks would go for Kyle Busch, it would be absent of confetti. NRF Productions proudly presents how Kyle Busch lost the 2008 Daytona 500. The prestigious milestone running of the Daytona 500 was met with the milestone moments that it deserved. This would be the first running since 1962 without the Wood Brothers Racing Team after Bill Elliott failed to make the race. Seven-time winner Richard Petty waved the green flag, and Fox would roll out these creepy deepfake graphics.
Jeff Burton, South Boston, Virginia.
Elliott Sadler, Emporia, Virginia.
Yeah, after this, I never ever want to hear anyone complain about the Fox cartoon graphics because the AI stuff, yeah, that takes the cake for the most creepiest thing that they've ever done. For Toyota, two bits of NASCAR history were dangled in front of them like a carrot for a rabbit to chase. A foreign nameplate had never won the Daytona 500 and had just one win total. Jaguars win with Al Keller at the Linden Airport. To put in perspective, 5 years after that win, the first ever Daytona 500 was held. But this time around, Toyota had the Joe Gibbs Racing threesome. Toyota, in the words of Darrell Waltrip, made a bit more horsepower than everyone else, evident with the Home Depot driver Tony Stewart and the FedEx driver Denny Hamllin leading laps in the race's dawning stages. Missing from the early jockey for position was the new M&M's driver for the 2008 season, Kyle Busch. But trust me, this 22-year-old was more colorful in more ways than just the paint scheme he graced on his Toyota Camry. He became experienced in quintessential Kyle Busch fashion, dipping down into the Friday and Saturday races during the weekend. In the NASCAR Craftsman Truck Series race, the younger Busch got to learn from the veteran Todd Bodine as the runner-up finisher. The Saturday show, meanwhile, saw Jason Ratcliffe and Kyle Busch contend, but nothing, and I mean nothing, was stopping Tony Stewart from continuing his Daytona 300 dynasty. And from the 24th starting position, everyone in Daytona Beach, Florida would know quickly just who had the target on his back. The guy everyone was chasing to get this Daytona 500. It took Kyle Busch all but 20 laps to get up to the front and join his teammates. With him getting up to the front, it proved the storyline of this Speed Weeks, as Speed Weeks 2008, Joe Gibbs Racing with its new threesome alongside the super team of Jeff Gordon, Jimmy Johnson, and Dale Earnhardt Jr. at Hendrick Motorsports, with Casey Mears being largely outcasted as more of a Pete Hamilton type. And for Kyle Busch in this race, I think for a couple laps he forgot exactly what team he's driving for, because as you can see, he pushed the main driver that replaced him, Dale Earnhardt Jr., into second, then working with the four-time series champion, the Brilliant Flame Warrior, to almost propel Jeff Gordon to the lead over his own teammate. Kyle Busch's driving in the early going triggered a talking point of the 2008 offseason. The industry as a whole, they were strongly critical of the Joe Gibbs Racing core, and they thought that they were going to implode as a team. Denny Hamllin, Tony Stewart, and now Kyle Busch, they were three distinctly unique personalities. In what would be race one of 524 races as teammates, Denny Hamllin and Kyle Busch battled each other on lap 65 like Cale Yarborough and Donnie Allison did on the final lap of the 1979 Daytona 500. The 11 team sent a message to the 18, and I believe they got it, because keep this on the brain. What is the specialty of FedEx? Sending things. The aggressive bumps and crosses over were publicly criticized by the man that perhaps you might not expect, and this was Darrell Waltrip in the Fox booth.
Now here's where Busch gets himself in a little bit of trouble. See how he's trying to cross over underneath his teammate for no really good reason. Now he's up there bumping him. I mean, that's all fun and games, but we got to try to win the Daytona 500 here.
You could plausibly say yes. Waltrip's commentary about Kyle Busch here, it was hypocritical. This is a driver, after all, that's nicknamed Jaws. He was aggressive back when he was young in the day. But let's look at it this way. Historically, Kyle Busch is compared to Darrell Waltrip for his blunt comments and his brash racing style. DW at the time saw a bit of himself in the eyes of Kyle Busch, so I think this was just more of him offering some kind words of encouragement. Because after that, he was pretty much a Kyle Busch fan, as he was of Dale Jr. and eventually Danica Patrick, at least from the consensus of the devoted fan base that is in NASCAR. Kyle Busch and Denny Hamllin, they continued to jockey for the lead, so much so that the next 5 lead changes in the race were between these two drivers, and they allowed the second pack of cars to chase down the 3-car breakaway of the 11, 18, and the 24. But Kyle Busch, he was ridiculously good in this Daytona 500, and that would become the theme of the race. Especially when you radio back to your team, everything feels good. As we're not just talking about the new, smooth Daytona, this was the surface before the repave. Almost everyone else out here, they were suffering with ill-handling race cars or vibrations, but here Kyle Busch was, I kid you not, almost a second ahead of the rest of the pack all by himself. By leading the halfway lap of the race, however, Kyle Busch would officially try to defy a NASCAR curse. No driver had led lap 100 of the Daytona 500 and went on to win the race since Davey Allison in 1992. But with just how ridiculously fast his car was, one that needed minimal adjustments to keep up with the track, this was the Daytona 500 to lose for Kyle Busch. If there was any liability to Kyle Busch's chances of winning the Daytona 500, it was definitely pit road. Some late race cautions meant that Steve Addington was thrown a Swiss Army knife of different strategies to reshuffle up the deck. Relying on the perfect car he had setup-wise, Kyle Busch would take 4 tires and restart 11th with under 40 laps to go, whereas eventual rival Dale Earnhardt Jr. opted for track position. Kyle Busch would prove that his car was exceptional again by making aggressive 3-wide moves, sticking his nose in close quarter style to claw his way back into the top 5. But with cautions breeding cautions breeding cautions, Steve Addington made more moves for the dash to the finish, and on the final pit stop of the day, Kyle Busch would do the one thing Darrell Waltrip said was the only way the 22-year-old would lose this race.
Got her locked up, slide, and whoops.
They're not allowed to start working on the car until now, till he gets back into his own pit box.
Kyle Busch would make a mistake on pit road by overshooting his pit box. He beat himself and he would have to restart the race in 9th. But with just how extremely good that car was, and his replacement driver wrecking himself out of the race, the AT&T number 31 was the only car in between him and being able to call his mom and dad from victory lane as a Daytona 500 champion. The 18 team strategy was simple: go as quickly as possible. They may be teammates, but Kyle Busch was worried that the 20 of Tony Stewart would make a move first if he bided his time, and while the media day consisted of quotes that the Joe Gibbs Racing drivers were going to work together, all of that was out the window in the closing laps of the 50th running of the Daytona 500. On this restart, you would be able to hear the thunder, and no guys, there wasn't a Garth Brooks concert in the infield.
The Toyotas go this way and that, and Kyle Busch has to back up to avoid getting a yellow line penalty. That takes him out of play.
Call it an experience, call it just wrong place, wrong time, but the restart gamesmanship of pre-double file super speedway restarts costed Kyle Busch the 2008 Daytona 500. Tony Stewart was far enough back to see Kyle Busch challenge and nearly get a penalty for going below the yellow line to choose the outside to get past Jeff Burton. And honestly, if Kyle Busch weren't the dominant car, then maybe he would have gotten more help than his rival on the inside. Because honestly, who on earth would want to help the dominant car get the clean air necessary to win? I mean, I guess at least he didn't give up the outside lane on the final lap like Tony Stewart did. A lose-lose scenario for Coach Joe Gibbs. So the 2008 Daytona 500 was a statement race for the colorful 22-year-old that was publicly scrutinized following his release from Hendrick Motorsports. His 86 laps led were the most of any driver, even more than the guy that replaced him that has been hailed as the Pied Piper of super speedway racing. But since this isn't a real racetrack, Kyle Busch found himself on the wrong side of history. At least his next Daytona 500 won't be painful to the point where he totally won't dominate the race just to get junked by 2 lap cars just past the halfway point, right? If you thought this was the most heartbreaking way to lose a Daytona 500, let me turn your attention to the video on Sterling Marlin's failed bid at a 3rd Daytona 500 victory. Or you can check out how current JGR driver Christopher Bell shook up the Joe Gibbs Racing norm. Other than that, this is Nathan for NRF Productions. Life's a beach, and then you drive.